December 21st, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. The Belgian town of Malmedy sits frozen under a December sky so dark it swallows sound. Private First Class Francis Sherman Currey stands guard at a stone bridge crossing the Wash River, his breath forming clouds in air cold enough to crack steel. His Browning automatic rifle rests against his shoulder. He's 19 years old. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the bridge, he hears it. The low mechanical growl of diesel engines. Then another sound, deeper, the grinding of tank treads on frozen earth. He doesn't need to see them to know what's coming. 5 days into Hitler's desperate winter gamble through the Ardennes forest, the German panzers have been clawing westward, trying to split the Allied armies and reach the sea. Malmedy is all that stands between them and the open road to Antwerp. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Currey raises his weapon. Through the pre-dawn murk, a shape emerges around the corner 400 yards down the road, a German tank commander, standing bold in his turret, scanning the American positions. Currey doesn't hesitate. A burst from the BAR cuts through the silence. The commander drops. The tank lurches forward anyway, its barrel swinging toward the bridge. In 7 months of combat across France, Holland, and into Germany, Currey has learned one unforgiving truth about modern warfare. When German armor rolls, infantry dies. The Browning M1919, 30-caliber machine guns that American doctrine calls adequate. The weapons his officers swear can hold a defensive line, they're about to face a test no training manual prepared them for. Because by the time the sun breaks over Malmedy 3 hours from now, Francis Currey will have used every weapon he can lay hands on. A bazooka he's never fired, anti-tank grenades he's never thrown, a half-track machine gun with a dead crew, and yes, that supposedly obsolete 30-caliber Browning, the one the Germans mock as too slow, too weak, too American. The weapon military experts on both sides agree cannot stop a determined panzer assault. Except nobody told Francis Currey that some weapons become obsolete. Nobody explained to the orphan from upstate New York that he was supposed to retreat when the odds turned impossible. Nobody taught the kid who'd been abandoned by his parents, shuffled through foster care, and rejected by officer candidate school as too immature, that there are battles you're not supposed to win. This is the story of how a forgotten boy with a discounted weapon held a bridge that changed the course of the Battle of the Bulge. How 31 pounds of air-cooled steel and persistence proved more powerful than 3 German tanks. How the gun the Wehrmacht called inadequate became, in the right hands, absolutely lethal. And how one freezing morning in Belgium, the United States Army learned that obsolescence is a choice, not a verdict. The German tank is still coming. Francis Sherman Currey never wanted to be a soldier. He wanted to be nobody special at all. Born June 29, 1925 in Loch Sheldrake, New York, he grew up in poverty, so grinding it erased futures before they could form. His father disappeared into the Depression's anonymity. His mother died when Francis was 12, leaving him and his siblings scattered across the state foster system like seeds on barren ground. The Hurleyville family that took him in ran a farm. Back-breaking work, sunrise to sunset, animals that needed feeding, and fields that demanded tending regardless of how a boy felt about his shattered childhood. Francis learned to keep his head down, do what needed doing, and expect nothing. Self-pity was a luxury the abandoned couldn't afford. He was good with his hands, good with machines, good at seeing how things worked, and making them work better. When he graduated Hurleyville High School in June 1942, 1 week after his 17th birthday, he did exactly what thousands of other farm boys with no prospects did. He walked into the Army recruiting office and signed his name. The recruiter looked at the skinny teenager and saw cannon fodder. The Army saw a body to fill a uniform. Nobody saw what Francis Currey actually was, a survivor who'd learned the most important lesson war could teach before he ever heard a shot fired. When you have nothing to lose, you fight differently than men who believe they have something to protect. Basic training at Camp Walters, Texas turned boys into soldiers through repetition and exhaustion. Curry absorbed it all with the quiet competence of someone who'd been taking orders and handling responsibility since childhood. He excelled at everything: rifle marksmanship, tactics, physical conditioning. His scores impressed his instructors enough that they sent him to Officer Candidate School. At 18, Francis Curry was the youngest man in his OCS class. For 3 months, he studied infantry tactics, leadership principles, and military theory. He graduated with honors. Then his superiors looked at the baby-faced teenager and made a decision that would define the rest of his war. "Too immature for command," they wrote in his file. "Denied commission." The rejection should have stung. Instead, Curry shrugged and reported back to the enlisted ranks as a private. One more evaluation that told Francis Curry he wasn't good enough, added to a lifetime collection of them. He shipped to England in May 1944, part of the vast replacement stream feeding men into the European meat grinder. By June, he'd landed at Omaha Beach, 6 weeks after D-Day, walking across sand still stained with the blood of the first wave. The 30th Infantry Division, the old Hickory Division, was pushing through France toward Germany. They needed bodies. Curry joined Company K, 3rd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment in September near the German border. They gave him a Browning automatic rifle and assigned him to 3rd Platoon. The BAR was 20 pounds of selective firepower, fed by 20-round magazines, capable of putting out 550 rounds per minute. In the hands of someone who understood its quirks and limitations, it could change the course of a firefight. Curry understood it immediately: the weight distribution, the recoil pattern, how to manage the barrel heat, when to fire in short bursts versus sustained suppression. Farm work had taught him mechanical intuition. Foster care had taught him self-reliance. The army had taught him to kill efficiently. But they'd also taught him something else, something that would matter more than any weapon proficiency on the morning of December 21st. They'd trained him on every infantry weapon in the American arsenal: the M1 Garand, the M1919 Browning 30 caliber machine gun, the 50 caliber, the bazooka, mortars. He wasn't supposed to be an expert on all of them, just familiar enough to recognize their capabilities. Francis Curry had paid attention to every detail: how to load them, clear them, fix them, fire them, how each weapon's ballistics worked, its effective range, its vulnerabilities. His instructors thought he was being thorough. Curry was being practical. He'd grown up understanding that the tool you needed might not be the tool you had. By December, Curry had survived 3 months of sustained combat through some of the most brutal fighting in the European theatre. The 30th Division had punched through the Siegfried Line, the layered German fortifications that had stopped Allied advances for weeks. They'd fought street by street through the German city of Aachen, the first major German city to fall to American forces. The fighting there was intimate and savage, building clearances at ranges measured in feet, not yards. Panzerfausts screaming down narrow streets, snipers in every window, artillery that brought whole structures down on friend and enemy alike. The 30th Division took 40% casualties taking Aachen. Francis Curry survived without a scratch. His platoon mates started calling him lucky. Curry didn't believe in luck. He believed in reading terrain, maintaining his weapon, and staying aware of everything around him every second. Luck was what people called skill they didn't understand. After Aachen, the division pushed into Belgium, chasing the retreating Wehrmacht through the rolling Ardennes forest. By mid-December, they'd liberated dozens of small Belgian towns and set up defensive positions along the German border. The brass told them the war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. They'd be in Berlin by spring. On December 16, 1944, they learned how wrong intelligence could be. Hitler had scraped together 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks for one last massive counter-offensive. The plan was audacious and insane in equal measure. Punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, drive west to the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. When the attack came, it came like thunder. The initial assault shattered American lines. Entire units were surrounded, captured, or simply disappeared in the chaos. German tanks and infantry poured through the gaps, driving west with a speed that shocked Allied commanders. Within 48 hours, the Germans had created a massive bulge in the American lines, capturing key crossroads and threatening to reach the Meuse. The 30th Division, battle-hardened and still relatively intact, was rushed south from their positions in Holland. They were thrown into the fight piecemeal, wherever the line was weakest. Company K ended up in Malmedy on December 19th. The town sat on the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough. The Warch River cut through it, and a stone bridge on the western edge provided the only crossing for miles. If the Germans took that bridge, they could swing north and outflank the entire American position. If the Americans held it, the German advance would stall. Company K dug in along the approaches to the bridge. They had tank destroyers for armor support, artillery batteries positioned on the hills beyond town, infantry positions covering the obvious approach routes. On paper, it looked solid. Then they learned about the massacre. 2 miles south of Malmedy, at a crossroads called Borgnez, SS troops from Kampfgruppe Piper had captured over 100 American prisoners on December 17th. They'd lined them up in a field and machine-gunned them down. 84 men murdered. Their frozen bodies still lay in the snow, visible from the road. The news spread through Company K like poison. These weren't just enemy soldiers anymore. These were SS killers who executed prisoners. Men who didn't take surrenders. The kind of enemy that turned modern warfare into something medieval and savage. Francis Currey, standing guard at the bridge on the night of December 20th, thought about those murdered Americans. He thought about the foster care system that had taught him what abandonment felt like. He thought about the officer candidate school that had told him he wasn't good enough to lead. He checked his BAR's magazine one more time and watched the darkness beyond the bridge. At 4:30 in the morning on December 21st, the darkness came alive with the sound of engines. The Battle of the Bulge was supposed to be Germany's last grasp at reversing the inevitable. By December 1944, the Third Reich was dying. The Soviets were closing from the east. The Western Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine. German cities were being turned to rubble by round-the-clock bombing. Every strategic indicator said the war was over. But strategic indicators don't account for desperation, or fanaticism, or the fact that a cornered animal fights hardest when it has nothing left to lose. Hitler's plan relied on speed, surprise, and weather. The Ardennes offensive launched during the worst winter conditions in decades. Snow, fog, and freezing temperatures that grounded Allied aircraft and made the roads treacherous for armor. The weather worked exactly as planned. American air power, which had dominated the skies for months, was useless. The surprise worked too. American intelligence had dismissed reports of German buildup in the Ardennes as defensive positioning. Nobody believed Hitler had the resources for a major offensive. When the attack came, it caught 4 American divisions completely unprepared. The speed, however, didn't work as planned, and that failure would save the entire Western Front. Small groups of American soldiers, often outnumbered 10-1, held crossroads and bridges just long enough to delay the advance. Hours became days. Days became a week. By December 21st, the German advance had stalled along multiple axes. At St. Vith, the 7th Armoured Division held a critical road junction for 6 days before being overrun, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded but refused to surrender. Nuts became the most famous one-word reply in military history. And at Malmedy, Company K of the 30th Infantry Division held a bridge that controlled the northern approach to the American line. The Browning M1919 machine gun that would become central to Currey's fight that morning was not a weapon anyone expected to be decisive. By 1944, the M1919 was considered adequate but unremarkable, a solid, reliable crew-served weapon that had been in service since 1919, air-cooled, belt-fed, chambered for the 30-06 Springfield cartridge. Rate of fire around 500 rounds per minute. The Germans had better. The MG-42, Hitler's buzzsaw, fired twice as fast. 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so high the human ear couldn't distinguish individual shots. It sounded like fabric tearing or a saw cutting bone. One MG-42 could pin down an entire American platoon. By comparison, the M-1919 seemed almost quaint, slower, less intimidating. American soldiers joked that you could hear each round leaving the barrel. German soldiers learned not to fear it the way they feared the MG-42 pointed in their direction. But the M-1919 had one advantage the MG-42 lacked: reliability that bordered on the supernatural. The air-cooled barrel meant no water jacket to freeze or puncture. The recoil operation was simple enough that farm boys and factory workers could field strip it in the dark. It fed from cloth belts or metal-linked ammunition without jamming. You could bury it in mud, dig it out, and it would fire. John Moses Browning had designed a machine gun that worked. Every time, under any conditions, with users of any skill level. In December 1944, in the frozen woods of Belgium, reliability mattered more than rate of fire. The technical specifications tell part of the story: 31 pounds without tripod, 24-inch barrel, effective range 600 yards, maximum range 1,500, operated by a crew of 4, minimum of 2. Gun fires from a closed bolt, short recoil operated. The cooling system uses rows of rectangular holes cut through the barrel jacket. Those specifications don't explain why soldiers loved it, or why Francis Curry would trust his life to it. The real power of the M-1919 wasn't in its specs. It was in what happened when you mounted it on a good position with clear fields of fire and enough ammunition. It created a beaten zone, a cone of fire so dense that nothing could cross it and survive. Individual bullets were less important than the sustained weight of lead pouring down range. American doctrine positioned M1919S2, cover approaches, crossroads, and choke points. One gun could hold a front that would require a platoon of riflemen. 2 guns with overlapping fields of fire could stop a company-sized assault. The Germans knew this. Their infantry tactics revolved around locating and suppressing American machine gun positions before attempting to advance. Kill the machine gun, and you kill the defense. On the morning of December 21st, the Germans would try precisely that strategy. They would target every American machine gun position around Malmedy with overwhelming force. They would succeed at every position except one. The German force approaching Malmedy wasn't typical Wehrmacht infantry. These were elite troops, veterans who'd fought in Norway and Finland. They'd been reinforced with armour from various panzer units scrambling to exploit the breakthrough. 3 or 4 tanks, depending on which after-action reports you believe. Infantry strength estimated at 2 to 3 companies, anywhere from 300 to 500 men. Against Company K's remaining effectives, roughly 80 soldiers spread across defensive positions covering a half-mile front. The math wasn't complicated. The Germans had overwhelming superiority in armour, numbers, and firepower. They had momentum and battlefield experience. They had orders to take Malmedy and the bridge at any cost. Company K had Francis Curry, and a collection of weapons that would prove far more lethal than anyone expected. The first German artillery rounds began falling at 4:30 a.m. Precisely. Not random harassment fire, but targeted preparatory bombardment. Shells walked methodically through Company K's positions, searching for machine gun nests, tank destroyers, command posts. The Germans had done their reconnaissance. They knew where to hit. Francis Curry pressed himself against the stone abutment of the bridge as explosions tore through the pre-dawn darkness. The concussion waves compressed, frozen air, squeezing breath from lungs. Shrapnel whined overhead, striking stone and earth with sharp metallic cracks. He could hear men shouting, calling for medics, reorganizing positions. Through the smoke and flame-lit darkness, he saw the first tank round the corner, 400 yards down the road. The tank commander stood in his turret, visible above the hatch, scanning the American positions with binoculars. Bold, confident. This was supposed to be a quick breakthrough against demoralized defenders. Curry brought his BAR up smoothly, acquired the target through iron sights, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil pushed against his shoulder in familiar rhythm. Tracers arced across the darkness. The German officer dropped into his turret like a puppet with cut strings. The tank didn't stop. Its driver couldn't see what happened above. The Panzer lurched forward, turret traversing toward the bridge, toward Currey's position. Behind it, more armor, more infantry. The morning offensive had begun. Currey's platoon sergeant, already wounded in the initial barrage, shouted, "Orders! Fall back to the factory! Everyone back!" The factory was a shell of a building 300 yards behind the bridge, better cover than the open positions along the road. But falling back meant abandoning the bridge approach. It meant giving the Germans a clear run to the river crossing. Private First Class Currey, 19 years old, made a decision that would define the next 6 hours of his life. He stayed. Understanding what happened next requires understanding what Francis Currey had become by December 1944. Not the orphan who'd been shuttled through foster care. Not the teenager rejected by officer candidate school. Those versions of Francis Currey still existed somewhere inside him. But 3 months of sustained combat had forged something harder. Combat does not make heroes. It reveals them, or destroys them, with no middle ground. Stress. Their minds fragment, unable to process the sustained horror of industrial-scale killing. Others become cautious, calculating every risk, paralyzed by the knowledge that any decision could mean death. A few, a very few, become calmer as the chaos intensifies. Their thinking sharpens. Time seems to slow. They see angles and opportunities invisible to others, not because they're braver, but because fear stops clouding their judgment. Francis Currey was one of those men. As his platoon withdrew toward the factory, Currey watched the advancing German tank with analytical detachment. The Panzer was closing fast, 200 yards now. Its main gun could destroy the bridge with a few well-placed rounds. Behind it, German infantry were deploying into assault formation, using the armor as cover. Currey needed an anti-tank weapon. His bar could kill infantry all day but wouldn't scratch a Panzer's armor. He scanned the positions around him. One of the knocked-out tank destroyer crews had abandoned their vehicle 200 feet to his left, and next to it, miraculously intact, sat a bazooka. The Germans were putting fire on everything that moved, machine guns raking the American positions. The tank's main gun had started engaging targets, each shot a thunderclap that rattled teeth. Mortar rounds were dropping with methodical precision. Currey sprinted. He covered the distance in seconds, running in the bent-over crouch every combat infantryman learns, making himself the smallest possible target. Bullets snapped past close enough to feel their passage. He dove behind the tank destroyer's hull as a burst of machine gun fire chewed up the ground where he'd been standing. The bazooka lay in the dirt, abandoned but loaded. Currey grabbed it, slung his BAR across his back, and searched frantically for rockets. There. An ammunition bag, half buried in debris. He pulled out 3 rockets, stuffed 2 in his belt, loaded the third. Now he needed someone to help him fire. It. The bazooka required 2 men, one to aim and fire, one to load and arm the electrical firing circuit, but his platoon had pulled back. He was alone with a weapon he couldn't operate solo. Then another soldier appeared, scrambling through the chaos. Private, name unknown, never recorded in official reports, just another rifleman trying to survive. Currey shouted over the gunfire, "You know how to work this thing?" "Yeah." "Then let's kill a tank." They moved to a position with clear line of sight to the advancing Panzer. 150 yards, point-blank range for a bazooka. The other soldier loaded the rocket, tapped Currey's shoulder to signal ready, and ducked clear of the backblast. Currey centered the primitive optical sight on the junction where the tank's turret met its hull. The weakest point. A perfect hit there would jam the turret or penetrate the thinner armor. He exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The rocket motor ignited with a whoosh and a blast of flame. The projectile streaked across the gap in less than a second. It struck exactly where Currey had aimed. The explosion was different from a typical hit. Not the deep crump of armor-piercing penetration, but something sharper. The tank lurched to a stop. Turret locked at an odd angle. The rocket had damaged the turret ring. The massive gun couldn't traverse anymore. The Panzer's driver threw it in reverse, backing away from the fight, useless without its main weapon. First German tank neutralized. Curry and his loader scrambled back toward the bridge position as German infantry, seeing the tank retreat, accelerated their assault. Now came the real problem. More Panzers were advancing, at least 3 more, and behind them, hundreds of infantry in winter camouflage. The morning was just beginning. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 6 a.m., the situation at Malmedy had deteriorated to the edge of catastrophe. German forces had overrun the forward American positions. Tank destroyers that were supposed to stop the armor had been knocked out or forced to withdraw. The prepared defensive line along the road had collapsed under sustained assault. Company K's remnants had pulled back to the factory building, a 3-story structure with thick walls that provided cover from small arms but wouldn't stop tank rounds. Maybe 80 Americans were still fighting, down from the company's original 170 before the Bulge offensive began. Francis Curry found himself inside the factory with 5 other soldiers, none of whom he knew well. The others were looking to him for leadership, maybe because he'd killed a tank, maybe because he looked like he knew what he was doing. He didn't feel like he knew what he was doing. He felt like a 19-year-old orphan with a high school education watching the German army methodically destroy his position. But feeling didn't matter. Action mattered. 3 German tanks were advancing on the factory from different angles. Infantry were moving up behind them, preparing to storm the building. Once they got inside, it would be over. Room to room, fighting against superior numbers in a structure they'd already surrounded. Curry looked around the factory's ground floor. Abandoned equipment, debris. And there, against the far wall, another bazooka. Someone had left behind. "I need rockets," he said to the nearest soldier. "Rockets are across the street, in that half-track." Curry looked out the shattered window. The half-track sat 200 feet away, completely exposed to German fire. The street between was a killing ground. Machine guns had it covered from multiple angles. Moving into that open space was suicide. "Cover me," Curry said, and went out the door before anyone could argue. He ran, not in a crouch this time, but in a full sprint, because speed was the only defense available. German gunners saw him immediately. Tracers converged from 3 directions. The whip-crack of bullets passing close, the snap of rounds impacting stone and dirt, the deeper boom of a tank gun trying to track a running target. Curry reached the half-track and dove behind it as a long burst of machine gun fire stitched the ground where he'd been. His heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. He opened the ammunition compartment and found exactly what he needed. Bazooka rockets, anti-tank grenades, more BAR magazines. He loaded his pockets and belt with everything he could carry. 50 pounds of explosives and ammunition. Then he started back. The Germans were waiting for him this time. They'd tracked him to the half-track, and now they had every weapon trained on the gap he had to cross. The moment he showed himself, they opened fire. Curry ran anyway. Years later, he would describe this moment with characteristic understatement. "They were shooting at me pretty good." Pretty good meant 3 machine guns, rifle fire from at least a platoon of infantry, and a tank that was trying to kill him with high explosive shells. He made it halfway across when a mortar round exploded 10 feet away. The concussion knocked him off his feet. Shrapnel tore through the air above him as he hit the ground rolling. He got up and kept running. By the time he crashed through the factory door, his uniform was torn and scorched. Blood was running down his face from a cut he hadn't felt happen. But he had the rockets. "Load the bazooka," he told the soldiers, staring at him. "We're going to kill these tanks before they kill us." The next 20 minutes turned into a clinic on improvised anti-tank warfare. Curry positioned himself at different windows, fired rockets at the advancing panzers, and moved before return fire could target his position. Each rocket launched with that distinctive whoosh. Each hit or near miss forced German crews to button up, slow their advance, reconsider their approach. He didn't destroy any of the 3 tanks, but he damaged one badly enough that it withdrew. The other two became cautious, hanging back, using their infantry as probes instead of advancing directly. That caution bought precious time. Then Currey saw something that changed everything. 5 American soldiers, members of a machine gun crew, were pinned down in a house across the street, the same house German infantry had occupied. The Americans were trapped on the second floor, taking fire from 3 directions, unable to escape without being cut down in the open. He recognized one of them, a corporal from another platoon who'd shared K-rations with him after the Aachen fight. The Germans were preparing to storm the building and finish them. Currey made another calculation, the kind that looks insane on paper but makes perfect sense in the moment. If he could force the German infantry back into the house, force the tanks to retreat, he could create a gap large enough for those 5 men to escape. He needed more firepower than a bazooka could provide. He went back to the half-track. This time, he didn't just grab ammunition. He climbed onto the vehicle itself, a half-track that sat fully exposed in the middle of the street, and swung the mounted Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun toward the German-occupied house. The Browning M2 Mardus was the big sister to the M1000 919, 50 caliber instead of 30, each round the size of a human finger, designed to destroy light vehicles and aircraft. Capable of punching through brick walls like they were made of cardboard, Currey opened fire. The heavy machine gun's thunder drowned out everything else. Tracers streamed into the German positions at 650 rounds per minute. The stone walls of the house started coming apart under the sustained fire. Windows exploded. Germans scrambled away from the second-floor positions they'd been using to pin down the American troops. Currey fired until the gun ran dry, then jumped off the half-track and sprinted back to the factory as German return fire turned the vehicle into scrap metal. The 5 trapped Americans used the chaos to escape. They ran from the house to American lines, 2 of them wounded but alive. All 5 survived because an orphan from New York decided their lives mattered more than his safety. But the fight wasn't over. The Germans regrouped. More armor arrived. The factory position was becoming untenable. Currey could see it. They needed to fall back to the main American line behind the railway embankment, or they'd be overrun. Then he saw the machine gun position. 200 feet from the factory, across the same killing ground Currey had crossed twice already, sat a Browning M1000 919 .30 caliber machine gun. The entire crew was dead or wounded. The gun itself appeared intact, still mounted on its tripod, ammunition belt half-fed. That machine gun commanded the entire approach to the bridge. From that position, a good gunner could interdict the German advance, suppress their infantry, and buy time for Company K to organize a withdrawal. Nobody else was going to man it. The Germans had killed or driven off everyone near that position. It sat abandoned. A perfectly functional weapon in exactly the right spot. Useless, because no one could reach it without being killed. Francis Currey looked at that machine gun the way a craftsman looks at the perfect tool for an impossible job. Everything he'd learned in 3 months of combat. Everything his instructors had taught him about the M1000 919. Everything his farm upbringing had taught him about making do with what's available. It all converged on a single thought. That gun could save his company. He crawled. Not running this time. The Germans had fire superiority now. Too many guns, watching too many angles. Running would get him killed in seconds. So he crawled through debris and mud and snow, using every scrap of cover, moving in short rushes when machine gun fire shifted. Elsewhere. It took him 5 minutes to cover 200 feet. 5 minutes of being completely vulnerable, completely exposed, waiting for the bullet or shell fragment that would end him. German soldiers saw him moving. They fired at him. Rounds kicked up dirt inches from his face. A burst of machine gun fire tore through his jacket without hitting flesh. He reached the gun position. The dead gunner lay slumped over the weapon, killed by a direct hit. Currey pulled the body aside with as much gentleness as combat allowed, checked the M1000 919's condition. Loaded, cocked, ready to fire. The gun's previous crew had maintained it perfectly right up until the moment they died. Currey settled behind the gun and took in the tactical picture. From this position he could see everything. The German infantry advancing in squad-sized elements, using terrain and cover, the tanks hanging back, providing fire support, the officers directing the assault with hand signals, all of it laid out in front of him at ranges between 100 and 500 yards. Perfect M1919 range. He pressed the trigger. The Browning opened up with its characteristic hammering rhythm, 500 rounds per minute, each. 30 to 06 cartridge, launching a 150-grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second. The beaten zone extended across the German line of advance like an invisible wall. The first burst caught a German squad moving between buildings. 3 men went down immediately. The others scattered, looking for the source of fire. Currey shifted his aim and fired again. Another burst, another German soldier hit. The advancing infantry attack stopped cold. This was what the M1919 was designed to do. Not precision shooting but area denial, creating a zone of fire so intense that crossing it meant death. The Germans had been advancing steadily for an hour, pushing back American positions through superior numbers and firepower. Now a single machine gun was stopping them. Currey fired in short, controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, managing barrel heat, maintaining fire discipline even as chaos swirled around him. His instructors would have been proud. Textbook machine gun employment. The Germans were not impressed with textbook technique. They were terrified. Return fire intensified. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, all trying to locate and destroy this one position that had halted their attack. A mortar round exploded 20 feet away. Shrapnel clanged off the machine gun's armoured shield. Currey kept firing. He could see German soldiers dragging their wounded back to cover. Could see officers trying to rally squads for another push. Could see the fear in their movements, the hesitation that comes from facing sustained, accurate fire. The M1919 wasn't obsolete. It wasn't inadequate. In the right hands, in the right position, with the right soldier behind it, John Browning's 30-year-old design was absolutely lethal. But even the best machine gun can't win a battle alone. Currey knew this. The Germans would flank him eventually, or a tank would put a round directly into his position, or he'd run out of ammunition. This wasn't a permanent solution. This was buying time. Time for his company to reorganize. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time for artillery to shift fire. Every minute he held this position was another minute for the American defense to solidify. So he held. For 40 minutes, Francis Sherman Currey fought from that exposed position. 40 minutes of sustained combat against overwhelming odds. He fired, reloaded, shifted position slightly to avoid counterfire, fired again. The ammunition belt ran dry. He grabbed another from the dead crew's supply. That ran dry. He found another. The Germans threw everything at him. Infantry assaults from multiple directions, tank fire that cratered the ground around his position. Mortar barrages that would have killed anyone without the armoured shield protecting the gun. Gun duels with German MG-42s that tried to suppress his fire. He kept shooting. Somewhere in those 40 minutes, the nature of the battle changed. The German advance, which had been methodical and inevitable, stalled completely. Their infantry wouldn't cross the ground, Currey's gun controlled. Their tanks wouldn't advance without infantry support. The offensive that was supposed to take Malmedy in one quick morning thrust had been stopped by a single soldier with a supposedly obsolete weapon. But obsolescence, Currey was proving, had nothing to do with the weapon. It had everything to do with the will of the man behind it. The Germans adapted. They always did. Elite troops don't stay elite by being stupid. If they couldn't advance through Currey's fire, they'd go around, flank him, surround the position, and destroy it from multiple angles. Currey saw them moving. Squad-sized elements peeling off from the main assault, working their way through buildings and terrain features to get angles on his position. Smart tactics. Professional soldiering. In 10 minutes they'd have him bracketed. The M1919's barrel was glowing red from sustained fire. His ammunition was running low. His position was about to be overrun. Time to move. Currey fired one last long burst to keep German heads down, then abandoned the gun position. He crawled back toward American lines through the same hellish ground he'd crossed to reach the machine gun. This time German fire was even heavier, because they knew exactly where he was. He made it back to friendly lines with a wounded shoulder he didn't remember receiving, and burns on his hands from handling the superheated machine gun. Other soldiers pulled him inside and immediately started firing to cover his withdrawal. "They're pulling back," someone said. Currey looked through the shattered window. It was true. The German infantry were withdrawing, their attack broken. The tanks were reversing, unwilling to advance without infantry support. The morning offensive that should have taken Malmedy in 2 hours had been stopped. For now. The fighting continued through the afternoon, but the character changed. The Germans probed, testing for weaknesses, but they didn't attempt another full assault. American reinforcements arrived, artillery support intensified. By nightfall, Malmedy was secure. Company K counted its casualties. 7 killed, 5 wounded from the morning action. Given the force that had attacked them, those numbers were miraculous. The position should have been overrun in the first hour. Instead, they'd held. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.